Hello everybody, coming to you live from the Francis Center to talk about flexor tendons. Want to let you know how much we miss you here, but we know you're doing an awesome job online. As you watch this, please know that I'll send you the slides, and also don't hesitate to send me any questions that you have. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to start by looking at the deepest muscle of the forearm and hand, the flexor digitorum profundus. Where it is in the name. We know that it's a digital flexor by the name flexor digitorum, profundus meaning deep, or the deepest muscle that flexes the digits. And so basically what I want you to look at here is that this muscle originates at the proximal 3/4 of the ulna, and it originates on the interosseous membrane. That's a deep membranous connection between the radius and ulna. This muscle is going to go through the carpal tunnel, and it's going to traverse its way up to the very distal phalanx of the index finger through the small finger. When I think about a muscle, I always think that its primary action is going to be at the distal most joint it crosses. And so when we think about the flexor digitorum profundus, starting deep in the forearm, crossing through the carpal tunnel, and going all the way to the tip of the finger or inserting on that distal phalanx, we know that its primary action is going to be DIP, or distal interphalangeal joint flexion. It assists flexions at all the other joints it crosses. So it's going to help with flexion at the proximal interphalangeal joint, or the PIP, at the metacarpophalangeal joint, or the MP, as well as at the wrist. And it's interesting because these muscles have a very central location in the wrist, and so they actually can help with wrist flexion, which can be a blessing and a curse, which you will learn a little bit more about in kinesiology. This muscle has an interesting split innervation. It's innervated by both the median and the ulnar nerve. So the index and long receive their innervation from the median nerve, and the ring and small receive their innervation from the ulnar nerve. So here's something strange I'm going to add, and you might be thinking, why is she talking about the lumbricals? The lumbricals are a very interesting muscle because they originate on the flexor digitorum profundus tendons. This is one of the only muscles in the body that has no bony insertion. So when you're thinking about the lumbricals, I want you to look at the photo on your right, and what you're looking at is basically the lumbricals originating off the profundus tendon. Let's skip to the bottom. Because they originate on those tendons, they actually also have the same innervation. So that's important to think about. They've got that split median ulnar innervation. So the lumbricals to the index and long, median nerve, the lumbricals to the ring and small, ulnar nerve. They're going to insert into the extensor mechanism, which will be the focus of a different, probably small lecture that you'll get. But basically, when you think about the extensor mechanism, I put the picture here for you. Basically, what you're seeing is here's that lumbrical muscle originating on the profundus tendon and actually transversing dorsally. So it's going to actually insert on the dorsal aspect of the extensor mechanism for the finger. Now, when you think about this, when we think about muscles, we know that here at the metacarpophalangeal joint, that muscle is actually volar, or anterior to the MP joint. Therefore, it's going to produce flexion at the MP joint. And then it crosses up and inserts into this mechanism that's dorsal to the PIP and DIP joint, so it actually extends the PIP and DIP joint. So when we think about muscle location, volar versus dorsal, volar are going to help with flexion, dorsal are going to help with extension. That's how this muscle can create both flexion and extension, which is somewhat interesting. More importantly, it attaches on the muscles, or it originates, from the muscles or the tendons of the flexor digitorum profundus. So it's really important to keep in mind as we're thinking about the flexor tendons. So our third long flexor is going to be the flexor digitorum superficialis. What's really interesting about this muscle is it actually originates past the elbow. So it's going to come from the medial epicondyle. We usually call that kind of the common flexor mass, right? That's that part of that medial epicondyle. And it's also going to come from the coronoid process and the oblique line of the radius. And so this muscle is considered to have multiple points of origin. This muscle actually bifurcates or splits right after the PIP joint to insert on the middle phalanx. And it's going to do a really cool thing that I'll show you in just a second. But what I want you to think about is that this muscle is going to split, and the profundus is going to come kind of up and between. So this is going to be the superficialis, or the more superficial of the two, and the profundus is going to come up and under. Again, the primary action of this muscle is the distal most joint it crosses, which is the PIP joint. So it's a producer of proximal interphalangeal joint flexion. It's also going to assist flexion at every joint it crosses. So it's going to assist flexion at the metacarpophalangeal joint and at the wrist joint. And like I said before, there's kind of a better or worse phenomenon there, because if that muscle can do all those things, how can it do all of them well at the same time? And that's a topic for further conversation as you move into your kinesiology courses. So let's look at this really interesting thing that FDS does. So here it is, superficial. Here's flexor digitorum profundus, deep. Here's flexor digitorum superficialis, superficial, and it's going to split. And it's interesting because it's going to come this way and it's going to come around this way. So the tendon itself is going to go split over and then fold under. And basically this is where it's going to insert onto the bone. And I think that's really interesting. This space right in here is referred to in hand therapy as Camper's chiasm. Our old hand surgeons really like to name all these things after themselves. So this space where the FDP comes through the FDS is referred to as Camper's chiasm. So let's look, when we're thinking about flexor digitorum superficialis, what I want you to remember is it's not that superficial. So when we think about deep, it's deep like all the way on the interosseous membrane. But when we're thinking about superficialis, what I want you to show you is it's kind of here. Look at all the things on top of it. You've got your pronator teres, you've got all of your wrist flexors, you've got palmaris longus. So even flexor digitorum superficialis is not really that superficial. It's just more superficial than the profundus. And so there's where the comparison lies between which of the two is deeper and which of the two is more superficial. So we're not going to get into the details of this, but I want to think with you for a minute about what these tendons, what their purpose is. And let's go over this picture first. The purpose of the flexor tendons is to create flexion. So I invite you with me for a second to put your hand out and create flexion. When you do that, primarily your flexor digitorum profundus is creating motion at the DIP joint. Primarily your flexor digitorum superficialis is creating the motion at your PIP joint. So here we are extended and we flex. Extended and we flex. Well, how does the tendon stay close to the bone to make sure that we get as much motion of the digits as possible? Because at the digits, you want more motion, you want power, but really we want over 100, almost 180 degrees of motion, 175 degrees of motion between the MP, the PIP, and the DIP. So how does the tendon stay really close to the bones to maximize flexion? Through these things. And these are called your annulars and your cruciates. So you've got kind of the annular ligaments look more simple, and the cruciates are more crossed. And so those annular ligaments to me look more like a tunnel. The cruciates are more crossed. So you've got A1, A2, A3, and A4. These are really important. They help to hold that tendon really nice and snug against the bone. And then you've got your cruciate ligaments. Typically we're seeing those closer to or at a joint. Those are a little bit more pliable and allow the digit to move. And I think it's important to notice in the picture on the right that when the finger is extended, the tendon is nicely held against the bones, but also those annulars and cruciates help keep it nice against the bone even during flexion. So when we think about that though, here's all those annulars and cruciates and they're holding those tendons really tight to the fingers. Well, and if you think about anything like tendinitis or really irritating those tendons by continually dragging them under those annulars and cruciates, those pulleys basically all the time, they could get really irritated. So we have these really cool things that you won't be able to see in the donor lab called synovial sheaths and bursa. And what these are doing is basically, I had a surgeon once tell me that the easiest way to describe this was like a slip and slide for your tendons. So what I wanted you to think about is each of these as its own little slip and slide, that it's filled with synovial fluid, it bathes the tendon in this nice fluid so the tendons can really easily glide one way and glide the other way. And so flexion and extension, your tendon is able to glide easily to create flexion and glide easily to allow extension. And so we've got one sheath for each digital flexor tendon. You've got this guy over here that helps those tendons as they come through the carpal tunnel to stay nice and smoothly gliding. And you've got one over here called the radial bursa. That's for the flexor pollicis longus tendon. And so basically the idea here is we want the tendons to be held really nicely right up against the bone, but these sheaths are going to help them slip and slide through easily. So you have nice fluid, easy motion into flexion and nice fluid, easy motion into extension. The last thing I want to show you, and I think this is a really interesting visual over here, and when you get it at home and can look on your computer, I want you to notice that the flexor tendons have a nutritional supply that's actually coming from the bone and inserting into the tendon, and these guys are called vincula. And the vincula are basically kind of a ligamentous connection that affords a blood supply so the tendons have nutrition of their own. This is a really important part of tendon healing. If you go in the donor lab and very gently pull up the tendons, once you dissect, like you dissected out here, and you opened up the synovial sheath and all the ligaments, the annulars and cruciates, now you're looking at the tendons, and if you bring them up ever so slightly, you can actually see those vincula in the specimens in the donor lab. So that's really exciting and cool, and that's how your tendons receive their nutrition. So that is our quick little mini lecture on flexor tendons today. I want you to remember that you're all strong. We know how resilient you are. We're all going to get through this online phase together, and I am here to support you with whatever you need. So don't hesitate to reach out with any questions, and I hope to see you again soon.